Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Thank you very much for the people that have subscribed since yesterday. I hope you enjoyed the video. I really enjoyed making it and I hope you enjoy this one. So I'm going to be looking at the First Crusade, which was started in 1095, so the very end of the 11th century, and I'm going to be exploring the arguments behind whether it was an act of aggression, an act of Latin Christian aggression against the Muslim population, and I'm going to be looking at some of the arguments for the First Crusade being an act of defence. It's a really interesting and quite complicated topic, especially surrounding the different reasons that we know about for launching the First Crusade. So I'm going to try and make it as interesting, well, it is interesting, I'm going to try and make it as palatable as possible. Most historians agree that it was an act of aggression, and I'm going to be telling you why, and I'll show you some of the reasons why. But some don't, some disagree. As with every historical topic, there are differing opinions, and I'm going to be telling you about why some people believe it was an act of defence. I think the main thing when looking at any point of history, but especially with wars, is to remember that we have a very different set of morals and ethics than they did 1,000 years ago, because this was nearly 1,000 years ago. And it's very important to look at not just secondary literature on the topic, so what people are writing now. It's also important to look at what people were writing at the time and how they felt at the time, because then you get a better understanding of how they felt, of whether they thought it was an act of aggression or defence. I'm going to be looking at mainly the reasons. There are a lot of people that focus on the military side of the Crusades, and while that is interesting, and I think there is a lot of merit behind looking at those, I'm going to be looking more at the practical reasons behind the First Crusade. So, before we jump into it, we've got to have a quick look at who was Pope 21 years before the First Crusade was, and that was this fellow, Gregory VII. He was a pretty important pope. He reigned as pope, as you can see, between 1073 and 1085. He tried in 1074 to launch a crusade. It wasn't known as a crusade at the time, but he tried to launch a military campaign to provide aid to the Byzantine Empire and then to go on to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. However, as we know, it failed. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Number one is that he lacked political support across Europe. John France, wrote a really good article called Patronage and the Appeal of the First Crusade, and he had a really good quote in it, which was Gregory VII had inadequate diplomacy, insufficient political support, and no international populist campaign of propaganda, which was what was needed to launch the successful First Crusade. He also failed to provide an element of spiritual salvation, which I'm going to go into later, and that was another one of the reasons why some people see the First Crusade as an act of aggression, and I'll explain that in a minute. So now we're going to look at Urban II, who was the Pope that launched the successful First Crusade in 1095, and he was Pope between 1088 and 1099. And in early 1095, which was the year that he launched the First Crusade, so this was 8 months before the launch of the First Crusade, he was in northern Italy presiding over a council in Piacenza, and at this council there was a messenger from the Byzantine Empire who was appealing for aid from the papacy. And that was one of the reasons Pope Urban II gave to launch this military campaign, and that is also one of the reasons modern historians, not modern historians, medieval historians, but writing nowadays, give as angling the First Crusade as an act of defence, because the Byzantine Empire had sent a messenger asking for aid. And I'll go a bit more into that when I talk to you about the Byzantine Empire. So later that year, in November 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II gave a very dramatic speech calling the nobility and knights of Europe to go on this military campaign, to go and provide aid to the Byzantine Empire and to reclaim Jerusalem, the Holy Land. And we can look at, there are some surviving accounts of his speech. All of them are different, which immediately throws up a red flag, but they're still interesting to look at and to explore. So Robert the Monk's account details that Pope Urban II had said that the Muslims had, this is a quote, invaded the lands of the Christians, depopulated them by slaughter and plunder and arson, kidnapped some of the Christians and carried them off to their own lands and put others to a wretched death. So it's pretty vivid imagery. Urban then goes on to say how the Persians had thrown down the altars after soiling them with their own filth and poured Christian blood into the baptismal vessels. So this is the kind of language that's meant to anger the crowd, anger the nobility of Europe, anger Latin Christendom. And it did just that. It was a very successful speech. It was probably more successful than he thought it was going to be. So if we look at Jerusalem, which was kind of the end point for the First Crusade, we need to understand why, and we need to understand why Urban II talked about Jerusalem. Why did he say that Christendom had to reclaim Jerusalem? Because since the early 7th century, it hadn't been under Christian rule. It was conquered by this fellow, Umar ibn al-Khattab. The guy in the background, this is Urban II at Clermont, or it's meant to be anyway. But yeah, so since 638 AD, Jerusalem had been controlled and ruled by successive Arab and Turkish dynasties. So why did Urban II use the capture of Jerusalem as one of his main points for the aims of the Crusade? He used very biblical and spiritual imagery in his description of Jerusalem at Clermont to try and evoke spiritual, honourable feelings within the nobility and Latin Christendom. According to Robert the Monk, Urban described Jerusalem as another earthly paradise. There is another primary source written by Fulcher of Chartres, which is really interesting. Again, by the way, I meant to say at the beginning, I forgot again, I'll put all of my sources in the description so you can fact check me, or if you want to go and read a bit more about it, you can have a look at what I've read and what I've researched. But so this other primary source said that Urban II told Clermont to free the holy city of Jerusalem and the holy sepulchre from the infidels' grasp. So again, very emotive language. So with the idea of spiritual salvation, which I talked about a little bit earlier, you've got this idea of the legitimization of violence to rule. It was called the Crusader indulgence, and essentially what it was, a very basic version, is that those who went on the military campaign, those who went on the First Crusade, would become saved and therefore would go to heaven. And it didn't matter what you'd done, it was a remission of your sins. And at the time in medieval Europe, this was kind of needed because you had warrior nobles, warrior kings. They used the sword to rule. It was a violent time. But Christian society frowned upon violence, so it was a really difficult thing to navigate. It created a kind of paradox, especially when it came to papally approved wars, which were becoming increasingly common, especially with the very powerful Normans. And this was kind of unprecedented. It was like a salvation by violence. It had never been done on such a large scale before, but it was extremely successful. And it's one of the reasons people give as arguing that the First Crusade was an act of aggression. It was a kind of selfishness whereby to become saved, to be able to go to heaven, you had to participate in the act of violence. And so was it because of this that lots of knights and nobles went on the First Crusade? Was it purely selfishness? In which case, you can say that was definitely aggressive, an aggressive motive. Another one of the primary sources that I've looked at is called the Gesta Tancredi, which is really interesting, and again I'll leave that in the description. But it talks about Tancred, and he was convinced to go on the crusade because of, and quote, Pope Urban's decision to grant a remission of all sins to all of the Christians setting forth to fight against the pagans. So we can see that at the time it was really important, it was very influential. And that is, as I was saying, one of the major factors for arguing that the First Crusade was a complete act of aggression. Just quickly, the image here on the left is meant to be Pope Urban II up there at the Council of Clermont preaching and launching the First Crusade. It's a very interesting image. So I'm going to leave it there because this is becoming quite a long video, but I'm going to do part 2, and in that I'll talk about, I'll give you a quick Comnenus and Piacenza in 1095, the Byzantine Empire, the call for aid, and then I'll talk about some contemporary historians that believe the First Crusade was an act of defence, and I'll tell you why they think that. But again, thank you very much for watching, and like I said, that'll be up either tomorrow or in a couple of days, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like or subscribe. You can leave a comment if you like and ask for a particular video, and I'll see what I can do. But thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a great day or evening or morning or wherever you are. Thank you.